Hey, y'all, and welcome in to Inside Black and Gold, a podcast where nothing gets better and everything just progressively gets worse and worse and worse. Good stuff, right? If that doesn't describe the last 3 years, I don't know what does. But I'm Jeff Nowak coming at you solo. It's going to be a quick episode, but I do want to break down a lot. So we're going to get into the Saints injury report for week 9. It's a long list, but reasonably positive. There's a couple of names on there that we'll have to watch, but Derek Carr did come back. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in this first segment. Then we're going to spend the second segment kind of talking about Derek Carr pretty exclusively, what he had to say, his thoughts on the locker room, his thoughts on the injury. So he had some interesting comments to make. So we'll get into all of that in the second segment. And then the final segment, Bobby Hebert after last game and on Monday and Tuesday, he's been going off on a tangent. Do the Saints have any quality young players, or at least enough to the point that you feel like, hey, these are star potential players. These are guys who are going to take over down the line for some of these aging veterans, because it sure doesn't feel like that these days. So I want to hear from what Dennis Allen had to say, what Mickey Loomis had to say on that subject. And then we'll kind of go through the list that Mickey gave us and talk about, do some names need to come off there? Do some names need to go on there? But first things first, let's go through the injury report pretty quickly. So first, we'll talk about 2 players that returned to practice. They are not on the active roster yet, but they have had their return from IR window opened. That means that if they are not on the active roster within 21 days, their season will be over. But it's a good sign that they are on the way back, soon to be returning. And that's linebacker Nephi Sewell and guard/center Shane Lemieux. Now, I don't know whether they like Shane Lemieux more than Connor McGovern at center. We only saw Shane Lemieux get 1 start at center. I thought he played okay, not great. So we'll have to see if and when he does come back, if they turn back to him at center. Either way, a good sign to see him back. He's listed with a knee injury. I think he's dealing with an ankle injury. At least that's the injury we were told about when he went on IR. So who knows, maybe that changed. I don't know. Either way, Nephi Sewell as well, linebacker who this team likes. They had every opportunity to just say, hey, good luck with your knee injury. We'll see, whatever. When you come back, we'll figure it out. They've been monitoring his rehab closely. They chose to keep him around. So it's a sign that, okay, this team likes Nephi Sewell. Now, there were 6 players who were listed as DNPs. That's Marshawn Lattimore with that hamstring injury. He's left each of the last 2 games early with that hamstring injury. I know there's some idea of like, oh, it's a business decision. I don't see that. I think he's actually dealing with an injury. And to me, that's worse, because when you have a recurring hamstring injury, that's a bad sign. He had a hip injury in camp. In week 1, he'd had a hamstring injury, and he didn't make a business decision in that game. You were winning it by 30. He was hurt. He left the game, missed week 2 with a hamstring injury. Fast forward a few weeks later, dealing with a hamstring injury. He ended up practicing fully last week, but then dealing with another hamstring injury. So, I don't think he's faking an injury. I think he's actually hurt. And my evidence for that is when you're getting burned by Simi Fehoko, something is not right when your name is Marshawn Lattimore, because those are not the matchups that he's typically going to lose. So we'll have to see with him. Either way, that's not a good thing, because you're already down Paulson Adebo, which means if he can't go in week 9, you are now without both of the cornerbacks that you started the season with as your starting outside corners. You'll have to decide, hey, how do we want to handle this? Do you want to keep Alontae Taylor in that kind of nickel/outside role? You'll have Kool-Aid McKinstry. Rico Payton is also on this list. He did not participate. He's dealing with an injury. So he's dealing with a back injury. So you are thin at corner. And I don't know how big of an issue that'll be in week 9. I think you can probably manage to beat the Panthers without your stars at cornerback. I'm not really worried about that wide receiver core taking advantage of you, or Bryce Young for that matter. But it's going to be a problem if this Saints team actually does have any illusions that they might be able to work their way back into the NFC South race, whatever. You're going to have to string some wins together to do that. And it's going to be a lot harder to do that if you're without Marshawn Lattimore. One player who didn't participate was Tyrann Mathieu. He was dealing with an illness. We don't know what it is, but that's a good sign whenever a guy misses that he's not dealing with an injury. Wide receiver Bub Means, he has a high ankle sprain. I expect him to miss some time. And again, you're talking about, hey, the wide receiver core is pretty limited, pretty banged up. Cedric Wilson's a guy who also didn't practice. He's still dealing with that hip injury that kept him out last week. So Marquez Valdez-Scantling, how you doing? How you feeling? You ready? Because I have a feeling they're going to be looking his direction pretty soon. The other player who did not practice, Kendre Miller, also dealing with a hamstring injury. Dennis Allen confirmed today that it was to the opposite leg from his training camp hamstring injury, which is positive and negative at the same time. It's negative in the sense that what the hell's wrong with this kid's hamstrings? It's positive in the sense that hopefully is less significant than the one he dealt with in training camp that kept him out like 6 weeks. So we'll have to see. But those are the 6 players who missed. No big surprises. The good news on this injury report, Pete Werner is not on it. We saw him leave the game late after missing that interception, dealing with some discomfort. He's fine. He's going to continue to play. And that's a big deal because as we talked about in our post-game episode, like his absence clearly was limiting this team in a lot of ways. And you saw him get back out there and suddenly that looked like a much more coherent, cogent, effective defensive group. So hopefully he can continue to do that and this defense can continue to take steps forward. As you mentioned, quarterback Derek Carr back to practice. He had a throwing session on Monday. It was about 50 throws. Clearly, he responded to that well. He responded well on Tuesday. He then got out and had a limited practice today, but he was throwing in team drills. Now, he clearly didn't get a full run of reps in team drills, which means Spencer Rattler or Jake Haener or both kind of took on some of those reps. Typically, your starting quarterback would get 90% or more of the reps. So it was probably closer to a 50-50 split than anything else. But he was out there throwing. He said he feels good. And, a little bit ahead schedule. We'll talk about it more in the next segment in terms of what all that means and how his comeback has gone, how his rehab has gone, and, how they're approaching it. But Dennis Allen said he's optimistic that he's going to play. If he does play, Jake Haener will be the backup and Spencer Rattler will go back to that emergency third quarterback option. Obviously, that's going to confuse some people. I'm not particularly surprised by it. One, because that's what you did in the first place. Like that's how you were operating previously. So why would you change? Again, like going to a player who's going to start multiple weeks is a different scenario than going to a backup quarterback in a situation you can't control. So that makes sense to me. Either way, Derek Carr coming back. Again, if this team has any illusions on making this into something in terms of like trying to have a second half of the season rally and winning a bunch of games. And again, I'm not going to tell you that that's something you should put money on, but if it's going to happen, it's going to be on the strength of a Derek Carr kind of renaissance in this offense and making this offense look a lot more like it did in the first 4 weeks of the season or at least 3 of the 4 weeks of the season where it felt like you were able to generate offense in a way that was tangible. Either way, some other players on the injury report who were limited. Juwan Johnson dealing with a shoulder injury. Alvin Kamara dealing with hand/rib injuries. That is something we've known about. Guard Nick Saldiveri back to practice, still limited with that shoulder injury that cost him week 8. I don't think he would be the starter even if he was healthy. I think he would stick with Lucas Patrick and Connor McGovern, but we'll have to see. Jamal Williams and Kool-Aid McKinstry are the only kind of surprise additions to this injury report. Jamal Williams is dealing with a groin injury. Kool-Aid McKinstry dealing with a hamstring injury, but both guys were out at practice. I don't think their status for the week is in doubt, but you're talking about a running back room that now you got 2 question marks behind Alvin Kamara. All 3 of your running backs are on this injury report. 1 didn't practice. The other 2 were limited. So what do? They re-signed Jacob Kabodi to the practice squad. Jordan Mims is also on the practice squad, so you could elevate one or both of those guys if you needed them. But that's a problem, right? Kool-Aid McKinstry, Marshawn Lattimore, Rico Payton. All of these guys are on the injury report. So you are dealing with some serious depth concerns at very specific positions. Now, I don't think you're in as dire of a circumstance as you were in maybe week 7 when you had basically no one to throw on the field against the Broncos from an offensive perspective. But that's when the injuries become an issue, in my opinion, is when they get localized to specific positions and you're basically down to your 3rd, 4th, 5th option. I don't think it's going to happen at running back because you're going to have Alvin and you're going to lean on Alvin the way you have been. But cornerback, I mean, you're now down to your 3rd and 4th option with your 4th option on the injury report. So, next, and your 5th option on the injury report as a DNP. So these are concerns. I don't want to say good news, but the positive news for the Saints is that they're at least in a similar scenario to the Panthers. It's one of the first times all season that I have seen the Saints opponent with an injury report rivaling the Saints in length. This time they actually have more players listed on their injury report, but it's about the same, roughly the same number when you consider, hey, they had 3 players listed with rest, right? So just to go through theirs quickly, the 3 players who were resting: linebacker Jadeveon Clowney, linebacker Josie Jewell, and defensive end A'Shawn Robinson. They were all DNPs, but again, that's just a rest day. The other DNPs: tackle Ike Ekonwu, ankle injury; tight end Felipe Franks, concussion. They call him a tight end. He's kind of their Taysom Hill, I guess. He's a quarterback. He obviously came up as a quarterback. They kind of use him in that similar role. The Falcons tried to do it too. It doesn't really work, but that's the idea with Felipe Franks. Either way, dealing with a concussion. Linebacker DJ Johnson, ankle injury; safety Jamie Robinson, knee injury; and tight end Tommy Tremble with a back injury. They have only one player who's limited. That's wide receiver Adam Thielen with a knee injury. Then they have a few players who were full participants. Defensive tackle Jaden Crumedy with an ankle injury; quarterback Andy Dalton with a right thumb injury. That is his throwing hand. Safety Jordan Fuller with a hamstring; tackle Josh Neiman with a knee injury; and then outside linebacker DJ Wanham with a quadricep injury. Now, I don't have a ton of information on any of these guys, but we will get more on Friday. We're going to bring in Des Johnson, as we have for every Panthers matchup, see what his state of mind is. He'll be able to give us more insight on what these guys are actually dealing with. What I do know is that the Panthers are planning to stick with Bryce Young, even with Andy Dalton back at practice and practicing in full. Bryce took back over this past week with Andy Dalton. He actually got in a car accident, which is where he got that thumb injury, which is a bummer for him. But I think they were probably teetering on giving that job back to Bryce anyway. Andy kind of spurred them to that one win, got the winless season out of the way. Now, if you're going to lose all your games anyway, they're 1-7, you might as well lose them with the young guy. I mean, what's the benefit of throwing Andy in there to maybe get you 2 or 3 wins? It's not worth it. And it's what I would imagine some Saints fans would approve of the Saints doing in a similar scenario of like, hey, you're bringing Derek Carr back. Wouldn't we be better off losing all the games anyway? In which case, why not just start Spencer Rattler or Jake Haener? Now, that's fair. And I think if you lose a few more games, you will be right there. I think right now the Saints are right on that kind of fringe of, hey, if you go out and you win your next 3 games before the bye, which I'm not saying is going to happen. I'm just saying that's where, if I'm the GM, I'm looking at it like, we're not out of this thing yet, so we're not going to bail on this thing yet. All that said, there's only 2 records that could be worse than 2-6. One of those, no one has the worst one, and only the Panthers and Titans have the slightly worse record than you do. So if you don't see this as close to being over, I don't know. Either way, I understand why the Saints are at least giving this the old college try and seeing if, hey, we got our quarterback back, maybe something fun happens. Either way, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next segment. Again, I'm Jeff Nowak. This is Inside Black and Gold. We just went through the full injury report. The biggest news on that injury report, Derek Carr, he's back, or at least he's on track to play. We'll have to see how the rest of the week goes. But he did talk extensively today about kind of that process, the difficulty of sitting out, his views on the locker room, where everything is. So we'll dive into that. We'll hear from Derek Carr and, just kind of get the lay of the land on that situation. He had some interesting things to say about the kind of team meetings, the locker room, that sort of thing. So we'll dive into that final segment. We're going to hear from Dennis Allen and Mickey Loomis on, do the Saints have enough young talent on their roster? Because it sure doesn't feel like it these days. Either way, this is Inside Black and Gold. We'll be right back. And we're back on Inside Black and Gold. I say we, it's just me. I'm Jeff Nowak. If you haven't subscribed yet, please make sure to do that. Otherwise, let's dive in. As promised, we're getting you ready for week 9. And also getting ready for week 9 is Derek Carr, who, I give him credit because he didn't come out and say like, hey guys, you miss me. But you do have to kind of look at this situation. If you're Derek Carr and you have been just relentlessly just slapped around. Like, this guy sucks. Get him off my team. He's holding this team back. Yada, yada, yada. All that and this and that and more. And here's the thing. Derek Carr does not want to miss games. The last thing he wants to do is miss games. But if you're going to miss games, man, it's got to be a nice feeling. I don't even know if nice is the word, but it's got to be kind of a satisfying feeling to know that, man, they were helpless without me. Because all I hear is how terrible I am and how I'm holding this team back. And then suddenly I miss 3 games. And not only do you lose, you didn't have a hope of winning. You weren't even close. It wasn't even reasonable. At halftime against the Bucs, you were like, man, maybe this will go well. No, it didn't go well. It didn't go well at all. It went about as bad as it could have possibly gone. And so, he had a lot of positive things to say about Spencer Rattler. And he kind of echoed what I said, which is like, I don't think Spencer was that bad. I think Spencer played like a rookie. And the problem is, you're not in a position where you can accept, hey, we're gonna play a rookie and lose all of our games. Like, you needed to win at least one of those games to feel like, hey, we're in this thing. And you didn't. But at the same time, like, in the back of Derek's head, as positive and as nice as he wants to be about it, in the back of his head, there has to be this kernel of like, yeah, now you guys get it. Because all I'll say is like, hey, if you were of the belief that he was holding this offense back and replacing him with somebody else would lead to better results, I think you saw that that's not the case, that he was actually covering up for a lot of the issues that did exist on this team. And hopefully with him back, you can start to look like a competent football team again. Because, like, here's the thing. With the games that Derek Carr was in there was only one that you really felt like, hey, this team didn't have a chance in. And it was against the Chiefs, the unbeaten 2-time Super Bowl champions, who make a lot of teams look like that. Either way, and even then it was like you were down by 3 points in the fourth quarter. So it wasn't like you got blown out. Like, these last 3 games, you were nowhere near competitive enough to feel like, oh, we could have won that game if things went a certain way. Nah, they didn't. They didn't go that way at all. But either way, so we'll see. One of the teams that the Saints are going to beat, I would bet my house on it. The Saints are going to beat the Panthers, but it's not going to change much. It's not going to change much in the grand scheme of anything for the Saints. But either way, getting Derek back out there will be a positive thing. It'll start to, I have to imagine, create some level of like hope within the fan base that they could at least compete in these games. But either way, this is what Derek had to say about kind of the process coming back from that injury when he started to feel like himself.
It was it was a lot of people taking care of me, from me, because they learned last year that, especially with the injuries and things that I had, that I would play through anything. And they learned that, yeah, you may be able to do this, but you got to be able to do what you got to do, And so our trainers, our coaching staff, Mickey, I thought they did a great job of making sure that I could get back and be ready, and not have a setback. Now, it's life. Anything can happen, but we believe we're in a place where there won't be a setback, because I feel good, feel confident. But there was stages. Some of the stages took longer than others. But now that we're here, it feels like it flew by, but every day felt like it was, 3 days. I remember looking at the sheet and it was like day 14 of the injury. I was like, gosh, it felt like 30. And so, especially when the team is, not winning and things like that, it was even harder, because you just want to, even in those moments when it's the hardest, when it's not going your way, that's when it hurts you the most, because you want to be out there with your guys, in those moments, trying to rally them and, encourage them and things like that. And there's only so much you can do when you're not playing, and so you're not in the huddle, you're not on the field, every day. So, but yeah, there was definitely stages. Ben and them would know the stages better than I would, but yeah.
But not to put words in your mouth, so that means you're not coming back at 80%. You're coming back a lot closer to 100, or?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Because this was something like, if I go to rip a ball, 60 yards and and it pulls, like, what's the point? Like, if you do that, now again, it's football, and I don't ever want to just put that stuff out there, but anything can happen. But we feel confident. I feel confident. I've shown it, that I can do those things, and now it's about just how I stack days and how it feels after that.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, because he talks about, hey, they're protecting me from me. It sure sounds like, based on how he's phrasing it, how he's characterizing it, had he had a shoulder injury very similar to what he had, in week 3 of last year against the Packers that they probably would have held him out. Like, I think part of the reason they were as cautious as they were with this injury is knowing that they probably shouldn't have allowed him to play in week 4 of last season. Because it's like, yeah, he could go out there, he could play, but at what level are you having him play? Are you doing more harm than good by allowing him to go out there and play? And it's kind of interesting to like understand that, hey, the medical staff probably learned a lesson in that process of like, yeah, we gotta be a little more forceful with these guys. And he was talking about how like, a couple weeks ago, he started to feel better and he was like, oh, you think I can play? And the head trainer just heard him ask that question, just yelled from across the room, like, no. I'm like, all right, fine. I can't. And, he did talk about it's a frustrating injury because he's the type of player that wants to play through pain, but it's not a pain tolerance thing. It was kind of a functional thing. It was, hey, if you continue to rotate and torque your body in the way you need to throw the ball, you'll just make this injury worse and worse and worse. And at that point, it will be a season-ending injury. So, I think the idea going in was 3 to 4 weeks. And so they kind of settled on, hey, we'll let you work back early, but we're not letting you work back that early. We're going to let you try to come back at the beginning of this window, which is the 3-week window. But we're not, we weren't stretching it to 2 weeks. And he kind of said, hey, if you had asked me after last week, I would have said I could have played. And that was when he was first able to kind of throw a ball down the field, and not necessarily 50, 60 yards down the field, but 10 to 20 yards down the field. And that's where you kind of work from there. Again, he participated in team drills today. That was an important step because, to some extent, it's not a live game, but it is hey, I need to be able to react. I need to be able to throw. I need to be able to kind of deal off platform and not in this non-perfect situation and deliver the ball with pace, with accuracy, and do it in a way that doesn't hurt and you're able to function. And so you're there, which means you're ready to play. And the good news and what he said, and if you believe him, he's coming back at 100%. So it's not that was the issue in week 4 of last year and week 5 of last year is, okay, you're coming back, but this is clearly not a quality quarterback performance. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration crept in last year of like, you're playing, but are you the best chance to win? Like, are you playing at a level that actually makes sense to play? And I think a lot of people would argue that he was not. He definitely wasn't in that week 4 loss. And I would argue that, they did play well in that week 5 game against the Patriots, but week 6, week 7, he didn't look good either. So you have to wonder exactly how much that was limiting him. And it's just interesting to hear him say that and hear the medical staff kind of was like, you know what, this time let's chill on that. One other thing he mentioned was that he texted Drew Brees when he found out about the injury to get some advice because Drew had dealt with an oblique strain or whatever you want to call it previously. And his advice was kind of like, hey, you need to maintain your mechanics as you work back. One thing that Drew said after that injury is as he tried to work back quickly, his mechanics kind of went away, and then that just everything kind of dominoed off of that, and he just wasn't as good as he wanted to be. He was making mistakes. He was inaccurate. So that's something that he told Derek that you need to work on. But here's the thing: the Saints are on a 6-game losing streak. It's not all going to get fixed in one go. And I thought, Derek was asked like, how do you avoid kind of feeling like you have to come back and be the savior? He had kind of a Joe Mazzulla type, hey, I only know one royal family or whatever. But I thought his answer generally was good and not tacky. So let's hear that whole thing.
I am no savior. There's only been one of those, and that is not me. I am here to be a great leader and to be a great teammate and to do my job to the best of my ability. And do I feel confident in what I can do? Absolutely. I feel confident in what I can do. I feel confident in what I can bring to our team, and that's exciting, right? But to save us or anything like that, that's not me. I'm going to come in and do what my guys expect me to do. Bring energy, bring effort. Like I said, be a great teammate. Encourage our guys, get everybody on the same page, lock in the details, hold each other accountable. We got 9 weeks that are promised to us, right? And or 10 weeks, whatever week this is, right? And there's just a full commitment just from myself to our guys. When I get back, I'm going to be a psychopath. I'm going to be crazy about the details and everything because we only get one shot at this, and so, I don't have any promises. I don't have anything except I'll promise great effort. I'll promise, long nights and early mornings, to make sure that we're at our best. And so, I'm looking forward to getting back and excited to finally, be back on the practice field.
And so, we'll see how that goes. But, the other thing that, I keep hearing like, hey, fire the coach. And I think one of the things that is going to save DA's job this year is that, okay, this 3-game stretch that things looked remarkably terrible. You were without your team leader, you were without the quarterback, and you looked like a team playing without a quarterback. The other thing that's going to impact this season is, have you lost the locker room? Because by all accounts, it doesn't sound like he has. And that's a factor. That's important. That's relevant to this discussion, because if as bad as things might get, as if the record can be what the record is, but as long as the locker room itself is not fracturing and falling apart, then why are you firing the coach? Like, all you're going to do by firing the coach in that scenario is invite chaos. And by that, I mean, like, one thing Derek said today, and I'm not gonna play the clip, but like, he's like, he's been in locker rooms before where it's like, all you need is a few like people who are pulling the rope the wrong direction to, and then a few people start listening to them, and suddenly it's a mess and it's a problem, and your entire culture gets fractured, and it permeates beyond this season. And like you're talking about, hey, you can fire the coach, you can bring in a new regime, you can do whatever. These are still the core group of players that you need to be in the boat with, And so you don't want to create a scenario where you cannot handle it. You cannot contain all of the personalities and all of the atmosphere in a way that works, right? Whether you're winning or not, you don't want to court chaos like that. And the question I have is like, oh, are we talking about last year? Are we talking about the 2023 Saints when you're referring to these bad apples? I don't know. It seems kind of relevant, but either way. So one thing and the last thing I'll note here, Dennis Allen, he has a monthly team meeting with the captains. And that's something that, they meet regularly in terms of like, hey, check-ins and whatever, but monthly they have a dinner, and they go to that dinner, and, DA said, hey, the returns I get from those are good. So I feel good about it. And I actually thought that Derek's answer was pretty candid in that regard. And this is what he had to say.
Yeah, I mean, we met, DA has the captains meet like off and on, but once a month, like for a dinner. And we had that this week, and I think he was looking for some information. I was like, and all of us to a man were like, we're good. The locker room's good, Double D, myself, Cam, are we, did we put ourselves in certain situations that's tough? Absolutely, we did that, Injuries, all that, none of it matters. We're in that position. And so, where are we right now? I say we're in a pivotal place, right? We gotta win. That's where we're at. But we're also in a good place mentally. Our locker room, the mentality, the way guys are flying around at practice. Because I've been around it, man, where it goes the other way, and practice just feels dull, feels dead. You try and motivate a guy, he won't do it. All that kind of stuff. I've seen it, and that was not the case with our team today.
Yeah, and so like, the DA's fishing for that. He's trying to find like, hey, are there problems? Are we having these issues within your individual rooms, right? Like, what are we getting? What is our atmosphere? Do we feel like everyone is pulling the rope in the same direction? And you may not believe Derek when he says it, but it does sound like that's still the case. And it's really more of okay, we need to find a way to win thing. And when you're talking about firing a coach, that's the biggest question. Is that happening? Do we believe that? And right now, I think they do. I think the GM does. We hear from Mickey Loomis every week, and he kind of gives us the same spiel. I don't know how much I believe that, but at the same time, like, if those are the answers you're getting, if those are the returns you're getting, then yeah, you're going to stick with that. And I had someone ask me yesterday, like, hey, are the Saints going to fire the coach? And my answer is usually, I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. But I do feel like whether you decide to move on from this coaching staff or not, the primary goal, the first goal that you're going to have is to get to the end of the season and then make whatever decision you need to make. But I don't think you're going to be jumping over a fence here to go run and hit the eject button if you don't have to. It's going to be a last resort, and it's going to be a situation that it has to happen. Otherwise, things are going to crack. And I think right now you're looking at that as like a break glass in case of emergency, but that glass is still there. Like that glass has not been shattered. That glass has not been cracked. Will a few more losses do that? Will a loss of the Panthers do that? Quite possibly. But I do think that getting Derek Carr back will be enough. If the Saints didn't have Derek this week, I wouldn't be sure. But I think getting Derek back will be enough to kind of push you over the hump of like, well, we're not the worst team in the NFL. That's the worst team in the NFL. But where are we exactly? Are we the second worst team in the NFL? Are we the third worst? Are we the 10th worst? I don't know. But that's a question to answer a week down the line. Either way, Derek's back, everybody. Rejoice and give praise. Derek has returned. He's not the savior, but he has returned. It hasn't been 3 days. It's been 3 weeks. That's all I got. Those are all the only biblical references I'll give you. Either way, Saints, Panthers, Sunday, 2-6 versus 1-7. Throw out the records when these two teams meet up because, who's watching anyway? It doesn't matter. All right. This is Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. We'll be right back. I want to talk about what Mickey Loomis had to say, what Dennis Allen had to say in response to the Bobby Haber about the Saints roster construction and whether there are actually good players on it. So with that in mind, let's hit the break. We'll come back and do that. Who dat? Stick around. And we're back on Inside Black and Gold. Jeff Nowak here, giving you a quick episode leading into Week 9. Saints at Panthers, the two worst teams in the NFL? Maybe not, but pretty close. Pretty close. Two of the worst records in the NFL, no question about it. Someone will walk out of here with a fresh 2 or 3 win record in the standings, and man, aren't they just feeling great about themselves? Either way, for both of these teams, I don't see a turnaround coming. And if you're the Saints, you hope that's not true. You hope that there is a turnaround coming, and you probably feel like you have a better chance for it than the Panthers probably feel right now. But I don't know why. It's mostly because you just have veteran players, and these guys are not going to just calmly walk into the darkness and just say, well, maybe next year. So I think you're going to see guys fight. You're going to see this. You're going to see a level of accountability for, no, we're going to get this figured out. Maybe it's too little too late, but we're going to do what we can. And as a Saints fan, I understand why that's annoying, because you're like, hey, we could get a top draft pick if we just lean into this right now. But based on what Dennis Allen said this week, based on what Mickey Loomis said this week, the November 5th trade deadline will not be a seller's market. Does that change if you lose to the Panthers? I don't know, but we'll have to see, because if they lose to the Panthers, then that means this is shot. This whole thing is done. But that's not something we will talk about until we get there. Either way, both of these teams should be, to some extent, looking forward and saying, what do we have? What is in our hands right now that we are confident in? And in a lot of cases, that's going to be, okay, who are your young players? Who are the players you're going to build around, right? Make it all out of these players. Figure out a way to do that and move forward. And, if you've listened to Bobby Hebert over the last several days, he doesn't think there's a whole lot of that. He doesn't think there's a lot of players that you can look at and even say, is this a star? Is this an NFL star? Is this a Pro Bowl caliber player? Is this an all-pro caliber player under the age of 26, 27? And I tend to agree with him. I don't think this roster has nearly enough young talent on it. But this is what Dennis Allen had to say on WWL this week when he was asked about the young talent on the roster.
And I said, I don't know. I think we got some good, very good players, but do we have any great or elite young players? And I'm talking about, look, Cam Jordan got a lot of skins in the wall. Demario Davis, I look at Alvin Kamara. I'm talking about 26 and under. Who's truly, would you say, is elite or a great young player? Like Brian Brzee, okay, he can rush the passer, not so much against the run. Who would you classify maybe as a great young player? Would it be Eric McCoy? I mean, I don't know. That list is short when I look at the Saints roster.
Yeah, look, I think we have some good young players. I don't know that we have any great young players, or at least we're not in that in that position yet. I think we've still got some young guys that, are developing that we hope can continue to get better and improve. But yeah, I think that's a valid question and a fair question. And I think you can win a lot of games with a lot of good players. You don't have to have a ton of what people might consider a great players. You need tough, smart, competitive football players that play the game, the right way. And I do think we have some of those guys, and then some of these other young guys like rookies and second-year players we're finding out about.
So I think that's an interesting answer. It's actually a pretty candid answer. I did not expect him to open up about that quite as much as he did, but it's a fair take. Like I think it's easy to look at like, hey, you won free agency, you signed this player, you signed that player, and we almost never go back and look at like, oh, did that actually work out? Was that a positive result? Did they get better for doing that, or did they just get more excitement from doing that? And I think more often than not, adding a star player is emotional. It's not always practical, right? Like there are examples of teams adding star players and diving in head first and getting better. I think AJ Brown to the Eagles is a good example of a team saying, hey, you don't want to pay your star. We'll pay your star and we'll benefit from it. They rode that to a Super Bowl. Now the returns since then haven't been quite as good, but still a high-end quality player that, you feel like, hey, this team improved for bringing that guy in. There are examples of that not going well. The Browns adding Odell Beckham Jr., right? That didn't go well. The Browns honestly doing just about anything. That didn't go well. But either way, like it's not always perfect. So I do think that to an extent, you don't need Pro Bowl players to be a competent winning team, but you do need to have developing players with a star trait. Like if you're talking about Madden, like, oh, do you have a star developmental trait that you're going to over time get better and better at? And the question I have is, okay, do the Saints have enough of those players? And I'm not sure, and I think part of it and I'll go back to the draft strategy. It's like, hey, one of the reasons you don't feel like you have enough of those players is because you don't make enough draft picks, or at least not enough draft picks that you hit on. And when you are hitting on all of your picks, like you did in 2017, it feels like, oh, we don't need to make 12 drip picks a draft because, hey, we know that we can get the key players. But then when you make a 4-pick draft and you miss on 3 of those picks or miss on 2 of those picks, you trade up and you spend 2 first-rounders on a Marcus Davenport, then that cupboard gets bare really quickly. And you kind of see what you can do. And with that in mind, here's what Mickey Loomis had to say to basically the same question when he was asked about it.
I heard that. It's a good question. I think, though, that we have to make sure that we understand the history of Cam and DeMario, because those are the 2 players he cited. If you look at Cam's career, he came to us in 2011, and the first 4 years of his career, cumulative, he had 118 tackles, and he had 29 sacks after 4 years. He actually made the Pro Bowl at the end of his 3rd year, one time. The next 4 years, actually years 7, 8, 9, and 10, he had 160 tackles compared to 118 tackles. He had 48 sacks in those 4 years compared to 29 sacks. He made the Pro Bowl 4 times. He was All-Pro 3 times, All-NFL a number of times. So what I would say is that in his first 4 years, he was considered a good player. It was those years that he became and was recognized as a great player. And if you look at DeMario's career, you'd see exactly the same thing. His first 4 years, he had 7 sacks. He had 332 tackles. He had 1 interception. He had 8 passes defense. It was good player, solid. Didn't have any honors during that time. In years 7, 8, 9, and 10, he had 18 sacks compared to 7. He had 475 tackles compared to 332 tackles. He had the same number of interceptions, 1, but he had 24 passes defense compared to 8, and made All-Pro first team twice in years 9 and 10 for him. So I would say the same thing. He went from being a good player, recognized as a good player in his first 4 years, to becoming a great player in years 7 through 10. So, the expectation that we're going to have these guys come in here in years 1, 2, and 3 and be great players is probably, for the most part, a little unrealistic. Now, we've got a ton of players that are 4 years or less that I think can get to that level in their next 4 or 5 years. Paulson Adebo and Brian Brazy and Tali Fuaga and Kool-Aid McKinstry. Chris Olave's on that path. We're high on Spencer Rattler. Both these quarterbacks, like I told you, Cesar Ruiz, Rashid Shaheed, Alante Taylor, Pete Werner, Chase Young. So there's lots of guys that are candidates to become those type of players. Will they all do that? No. That would be unrealistic to expect that. But certainly we have a lot of guys, and there's others as well, that have that opportunity.
So yeah, that's a long answer there, and I think it does kind of boil down to Mickey saying a very different thing from what DA was saying, but also saying at the same time kind of the same thing in that, hey, you're going to list guys like Cam Jordan and Demario Davis, and you're going to say, hey, well, we don't have a cabinet full of these guys, but at the same time, Demario was not Demario Davis until midway through his career, right? Like he kind of came into his own. He was a good player, not a great player. Now we look at him as an elite player, probably a team Hall of Famer, a guy that has gained respect around the league and has made Pro Bowls and all pro. But he's also a guy that, you could look at 4 or 5 years ago and say, like, this guy's made a single all-pro team. This guy doesn't get any of the respect. So it's not that, hey, you're going to draft that guy. You're going to develop that guy. Cam, the same way. I mean, Cam, I think from year 2 on was a pretty consistent player. And that's why he's going to be probably a Hall of Famer, is the consistency. But at the same time, did you get that early on, or was that something that developed? I don't know. The other players he named, and that's what I'm interested in, is the actual list of players that Mickey came out with. And that includes Paulson Adebo, Brian Brzee, Tali Fuaga, Kool-Aid McKinstry, Chris Olave, Cesar Ruiz, Rashid Shaheed, Alante Taylor, Pete Werner, and Chase Young. And there's a few names on that list, and I tweeted that list out this morning, and I thought it was interesting because everyone immediately went to Chase Young and said, why is he listing Chase Young? I'm like, I don't know. Chase Young's 25 years old, and he hasn't been nearly as bad as you think he's been. Meanwhile, no one reacted to Brian Brzee, and I find that interesting because, if you look at Brian Brezee's PFF grades, and no, PFF grades aren't everything, but he's struggled. We're talking about a team that keeps getting gashed in the run game. He's a big part of that. And so, I don't know if you've seen the development out of him, and I don't know if maybe the scheme is not working for him the way you might want it to. Maybe the coaching isn't working for him the way you might want it to, but that's the guy that I'm looking at there. Like, is he the star trait, the star potential? Paulson Adebo is interesting on that list as well, because you're talking about a guy who broke his femur, and I see a lot of people say he's probably not going to be on the roster next year. I actually think there's a much better likelihood that he's on the roster next year because of that injury. Because, hey, what other team is going to be throwing a big contract his way? It's more likely that the Saints, the team that probably is a little bit more comfortable with his medical history and is going to be able to work with him very closely throughout his rehab process, is going to be the team most likely to hand him a contract and say, hey, we're going to pay you X amount of dollars and you can kind of earn that big contract back. They're not going to have to offer him a big deal. And that's what I was assuming was going to happen. He was going to get kind of that Tyson Campbell range deal that the Saints weren't going to match. Now I think they probably could afford to keep him, and they like him. So I think you probably do keep him. But regardless, either way, it's an interesting list. And it's one that I would probably take maybe Cesar Ruiz off of. Like, I think we know what Cesar Ruiz is. I don't think he's going to continue to develop into anything more than a quality starting guard. Still not a terrible player. I'd like to see Brian Brzee develop. I'd like to see some of these other guys, Fuaga, McKinstry, Olave, continue to develop. Shaheed continues to develop. But either way, this is not a particularly inspiring list. And it's also one that doesn't include Trevor Penning, Isaiah Foskey, Peyton Turner, which is like, if I'm a young player and my GM is just and to be fair, Mickey said, hey, this is not a complete list. He's also high on the quarterbacks, the young quarterbacks, whatever. But if I'm a young player and I hear my GM just saying, I'm going to list a bunch of players off the top of my head that I feel very confident in that can develop down the road, and I'm a first and second round pick and I don't appear on that list, that's not a good sign for me. And that's not a good sign for the Saints. You are talking about this. The GM is naming a list of young players that he thinks can develop down the road. And he did not name a first round pick from 3 years ago, a first round pick from 4 years ago, and a second round pick from last year. That's bad, guys. That's bad. So either way, we'll see how that goes. But I just thought that was some interesting insight, and we'll find out how that develops down the road. Maybe the Saints can win on Sunday and get this thing started. Maybe they can ruin a draft pick, and make sure that they can add another average star player to their roster. But for now, we'll have to see how it goes. Anyway, that's going to be the end of this podcast. Thanks, everyone, for hanging out. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. We'll be coming at you with an episode later in the week, kind of previewing the matchup with the Panthers. We're going to bring back Desmond Johnson, our resident Panthers masochist, I think would be a good word for what would happen if you've been covering the Panthers the last few years. But hey, the Saints haven't been much better. They've just been a little bit closer to, they're just close enough to drive you crazy. Either way, Derek Carr's back, baby. Woo! Let's do it. I'm Jeff Nowak. This is Inside Black and Gold. Thanks, everyone. Peace.